I knew that once I opened fire, it was a suicide mission. But I couldn't just let those kids get hurt. They didn't deserve that. I did my best to make sure they were safe. Managed to get a hold of someone I trusted, to get them the help they needed. As for what I was going to do next, I didn't know. I tried to go home, but when I did, I was practically thrown out by my own family. My father was a bit more understanding, but he knew the longer I stayed, the more I was in jeopardy. And he ended up being right.
A soldier from a renegade planet known locally as Talihara committed an act of treason by killing a high-ranking Sitkar official and throwing its severed head as he escaped with 3 fugitives. These fugitives were children, rough ages from 8 to 12 Earth years, sentenced to death and marked with likely false charges to cover for the Sitkar and their appetite for blood. The soldier, a man named Ilarion, was once a loyal follower of his government's regime, but quickly turned against his home as he saw the truth before his eyes. It was during his escape that the official was killed, having no other option but to use security overrides in the commandeered escape vessel to decapitate the creature. Once the children were safe and his distress beacon was answered, the militant operation known as the Galactic Federation of Worlds offered refuge for Ilarion, to which he only asked for a chance to retrieve his family still on Talihara before officially accepting. Upon his return home, word of his actions already reached his family, and they immediately turned against him. Unable to convince any of them to leave with him, Ilarion had no choice but to flee. During his second escape, he was rendered unconscious and captured, only to be awoken on a surgical table. When he started waking up, he realized his torso was sliced open, his ribcage damaged, and intestines exposed. A Sitkar scientist was given Ilarion for study, granted full permission to conduct his examinations without restriction. The experimentations would last hours before someone came to the rescue, likely a squadron from the Galactic Federation of Worlds themselves. As for who exactly was his rescue party, Ilarion was too weak to tell faces apart. He was just happy to see someone human. The squadron recovered him, taking him as quickly as possible to their medical facilities to heal his physical injuries. His future was set with 2 choices: either find another world to live or enlist with the Federation and receive training. To atone for his involvement in Talihara's regime, and with the convincing of a reunited childhood friend and the children he rescued, Ilarion enlisted. As part of his tour of duty, Ilarion and his now wife became part of an envoy program to assist in the liberation of a world falling into the same influences as Talihara. His childhood friend turned wife was first to embark. During his last missions before his envoy deployment, Ilarion assisted in the rescue and rehabilitation of abducted children. One such mission that seemed to stick out the most was one that took place in the American Midwest. The target, a young girl being abducted from her home by Navy forces. The squad, led by now High Commander Thor Han, was successful in their rescue, quickly taking the girl home after a thorough examination and procedure to help repress the ordeal until it was time for her to step into action. Upon returning to the mothership, Ilarion had some time to prepare for his envoy deployment. He knew this mission would be far from a vacation. He would be called into action, but none of it mattered. To him, his only concern was the safety of all those he helped, and if he would ever see them again. Something about the latest mission weighed a bit more heavy on the heart than the others. Thor Han recognized this, assuring him that all would be all right in the end, but left a clue for Ilarion, hinting that a reunion with the child was on the horizon. Perhaps this was in fact a hint that there was more than meets the eye, a thread that served as Ilarion's motivation to fight, even as he stepped into the life and body of Dakota Frandsen on Earth. Perhaps he knew what was to come next. Maybe he knew the eyes that would be on him, but some things in this cosmos are too grand to encapsulate into words. After all, this is a tale that defies all known logic of time and space, love and war, gods and monsters.
I was born January 19th, 1996, if you could call it that. The day I was born, I remember certain details that really shouldn't be in place. That only later in life I would learn would be memories of my relatives, bloodline that came together in order to make this physical body. It was as if I was watching everything being downloaded very quickly and could only recall certain images that emerged. Some of the first ones I was able to recall were through the eyes of my grandparents as they were on their dates when they first got together. Others were a little harder to trace, though I was able to quickly theorize through DNA testing who they might be. One such example was the images of a young girl in Mayan attire being sacrificed with a blow to the head. DNA testing revealed that certain genetic markers in my blood on my mother's side actually indicate that a particular mummy that was found in 1996, known as Mummy Juanita, is actually an ancestor of mine. For the ones that I still have yet to officially pin down, likely include Nazi involvement, as well as memories from my life as a Larian, the life I would likely return to when this journey is over. I remember the transfer process as well, just before these memory flashes took place. And I remember placing my hand on the glass of the stasis pod that Alarian's body currently sits in. I remember placing my hand on there because a woman I deeply cared about placed hers there as she said her final goodbyes. She was quite emotional, and for a long time I theorized this could have been my wife, the ET that would have identified herself as my wife and the mother of the children. However, I'm starting to realize that maybe that was actually my oldest daughter, who did resemble me quite a bit in her youth, started taking on more of her mother's traits as she got older. And come to find out, this was not going to be the last time we would reunite. In November of 1998, this physical body was only about 2 years old. This is one of the events that I've struggled with the most in recounting, simply because the implications of it, even to this day, horrified me. This was the day that my stepmother tried to kill me. Growing up, my first couple of years of life, I had shared custody between my parents who were never married. And because my father had to go to work, my stepmom was the babysitter, which technically wasn't a lie on my father's part. It would have been November 1998. This was at least according to court records. My stepmother had me and my younger sister at the time We were just sitting in the living room watching TV, trying to stay up to tell our dad goodnight. None of my siblings are fully related to me. We're all half-blood. First thing I noticed is that she goes to take my younger sister away, and I figured my sister was starting to nod off. She was not even one yet, barely able to get up and start walking around. I figured she was just getting ready for bed. I zoned back out into the TV, and the next thing I know, there's this sharp pain in the back of my neck. Before I realized what happened, this event seemed to trigger some sort of psychic response. I already had some sort of disposition due to my family's bloodline, as I would learn later in life, but it is possible that the day I was born, back in 1996, part of my abilities were activated due to complications my mother had while in labor. I was 12 pounds 4 ounces, her first baby, so almost guaranteed to cause issues. And needless to say that my family has a bit of a history with larger births. And there have been a number of women in our family who have had serious potentially life-threatening complications just because they were trying to deliver one of us. Maybe that was what triggered this. I don't know. After I felt the pain in my neck, it was like I was being transported somewhere. I remember going down this long corridor, and the walls seemed like they were made out of some sort of sand. Honestly, the imagery kind of reminded me of Egypt, but the more I've dug into my past, the more I've found out in recent years, it may have some sort of connection with Sumerian. The halls of this corridor would light up by torches. And I mean actual flame torches, for those of you on the UK side of the world. These torches would light up as I would speed down this hall, and all of a sudden I'd come to this throne room. There was this being, absolutely massive, sitting on the throne just waiting. I could tell right away he was not human. He was fairly tall, somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. He looked like he was half man, half reptile. Or at least that's how I could understand it at the time. He looked like, to a young kid, he looked like he was half dragon. Somehow. I don't know. I didn't understand what was going on. To make a long story short, this being realized I was in the room, tried to act like it was sympathizing with me. Understood that there was a lot of evil in the world. He was looking for people to help fight it. And he tried to offer me a deal. Said if I were to help him when the time came, I would be given the power to make sure people like that could never hurt me again or hurt anybody else. As a young kid, I didn't realize the full scope of what was going on, but I realized something was obviously not right about what was going on with my dad and my stepmom. And I was tempted to take it, to be completely honest. But something intervened. Exactly what there's been a lot of theories tossed around, but I honestly don't know for sure. I just remember hearing this voice coming from the end of the corridor. You just absolutely screamed. It was deep. It was a male voice. It had power behind him. And for some reason, I felt like this was a voice I could trust. This voice would start screaming, "Dakota, don't listen to him. Fight now. Fight back." This being, whoever he was, I have a few theories. And if I'm right, it's intimidating as hell. But I can't deny the possibility. Whoever he was pissed that this other voice was coming in. I could hear it clear as day. Again, this voice screamed at me, "Fight." Somehow, I was able to launch myself at this being. its wardrobe, sort of like a purplish color, had with gold atonements. It looked like, again, this looked like something you would expect out of ancient Egypt. This was the only frame of reference I knew. The only reason I was able to come this close was because I was big into anime growing up, and it reminded me a lot of the symbolism I would see in Yu-Gi-Oh! But it had kind of like a purple and robe with kind of goldish tints that may have marked some sort of ranking. But he also had this kind of winged crown that he wore. I launched myself towards its head, took the crown off of, yanked the crown right off of him, and bashed it upside its face. And this thing was screaming. I mean, if you were to look up the recent sound recreations that are supposed to be the more scientifically accurate depictions of like the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Spinosaurus, it sounded very, very similar. I tried to recreate a sea car's roar earlier on in this broadcast to the best of my abilities. But hearing this thing scream just sent chills down your body. Next thing I know, something grabs me behind and quickly yanks me out of there. I wasn't able to get a good look at who it was, but the first thing I remember seeing in my peripheral, what looked like silver wings. For the accuracy of this recall, I cannot guarantee for obvious reasons. I don't know if any part of my mind maybe have twisted it over the years, because it's taken me a lot of courage to be able to talk about this particular incident. Nevertheless, I swear on my soul that this happened. Once the vision ended, I was back with my stepmother, and inevitably was forced into a confrontation where my only way out was stabbing her with a 6-inch butcher knife that she slapped in my hand. She survived. She's still alive to this day. There was a point in time where I tried to let bygones be bygones, since she was the biological mother of my other siblings, or at least the ones I knew about at the time. But nevertheless, she decided to let herself spiral into drugs. That's where she sits currently today. After an investigation and court-mandated therapy, because that police district in charge of the investigation already has a shady past. The kind of shady past that involves ruling a dismembered body found in garbage bags in a truck driven over the side of the Snake River Canyon as a suicide level shady. That's actually a true story. But nevertheless, the therapist I was assigned to quickly realized that I was acting in self-defense, and that there were some seriously messed up dynamics between my father and stepmother. Custody of me was taken away from my father after he stopped showing up to supervised visits. But as for that reptilian being, visits from the stars only seemed to amplify after that. Years go by, I would dream about spaceships, psychic abilities, even being able to physically fly like Superman or something. At first, I would just toss these aside as, the imagination of a young boy into superheroes, but lately I found myself reevaluating a lot. There were even points where dreams seemed to be formatted like the cartoons I used to watch, and according to, I believe it was David O'Brien or something like that, he was a guest on the show. He comes from the Birmingham UFO group, that several abductees may have had dream memories formatted like cartoons. Fast forward through time, one such incident, perhaps one of my more famous examples, sticks out above the rest, as I ended up being somehow transported 30 miles away from home. A lot of you who have heard this story have proposed possible teleportation, comparing me to Jean-Charles Moyen. As it turns out, Jean-Charles and I may have some very similar paths, but the roads aren't quite the same as many of you have thought. When I was about 6 years old, this was summer 2002, estimated around August. There was one night where I was just at home. It was me, my little sister, who was barely a year old at the time, and me. It was the one day out of the blue, all of a sudden I just felt completely drained and needed to go to bed. Nobody really thought much of it. My mom was the type that if her kids wanted to go to bed early, at most she would do is just make sure they had a meal in their bellies and any homework was done. And she just said, all right, good night. Later that night, I was woken up by something. It wasn't uncommon for sleepwalking episodes. I will admit that now. It's something that's run through my family, and there's been a couple of times I've almost taken a metal baseball bat because my mother didn't realize I was in the kitchen grabbing a midnight snack. This night was different. I woke up because it sounded like somebody had kicked something in my room, like they accidentally bumped a toy that was on the floor or something. Immediately, I noticed that there was this blue haze sort of in the room. I looked around and I started to realize that I wasn't alone. There was at least 3, I would say, somewhat tall grays. They were a little over 5 foot each. I would learn later on that these most likely be ones known as X5s. They're essentially biological based androids, for lack of a better word. They're not really capable of a whole lot, but they are a main abduction force for the Naboo. The second I started realizing that something was up, something was in my room, I started screaming for my mom. Mom, get up! I need you in here! I need you in here now! My mom didn't wake up. In fact, no, she did kind of mutter something in her sleep, but in retrospect, it was likely something involved like, don't wake up your sister. And I kept screaming, Mom, I need you in here. There's something in my room, and they're not people. Eventually, my younger sister, who was, like I said, only barely a year old at the time, she hears me and starts crying. It almost sets off a sense of urgency with these, my abductors. They realized that it wasn't going to be as swift a capture as they anticipated, which, as a young kid, I was doing everything I could to try to fuck up their plans, kick, scream, yell, trying to draw as much attention to me as possible. 2 of the beings left my room and went throughout the rest of the house. This old house, I remember it clearly. It still looks the same, at least on the outside, as I remember it. But towards the back of the house, it was sort of like one of those open floor plans. There was a spot for the kitchen. Then towards the back of the house was the 3 bedrooms. Mine was on the far right as she entered the house. My sister was right in the middle. My mom was on the far left. One of the beings went to my sister's room and basically just knocked her out, put her back to sleep. As my sister was screaming, that's when I started being taken out of my bed and physically out of the house. I remember seeing my mom. I kept trying to scream for her, but it seemed like something was trying to restrain me. I could hear myself mentally screaming, like I was trying to broadcast some sort of message. Basically saying, Mom, get up, something's happening, I'm being taken. Briefly, my mom did wake up, looked right at me as I was being taken. Then the third being just sort of kind of waved his hand like this. She went back to sleep. Now, as an adult, I realized fully that my mother didn't intend on doing that she was essentially knocked back out herself. But in the eyes of a 6-year-old child, who all he knows is that some strange thing is literally carrying him out of his house. All he knows is that he is in danger. To see the one person closest to him that he's supposed to trust when something bad happens, just nod off back asleep. You can just imagine what it does to the kid's head in that moment. But I still kept screaming. Whether or not a sound was coming out of me, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. It felt like I was screaming, but honestly, the best I know to describe it is like comatose patient, or patients that are severely paralyzed on hospital shows that you can hear them trying to communicate internally, but externally they're not able to show many signs of life. Throughout this ordeal, there was this sound that kind of emanated through the air, kind of like this. Best way I know to describe it is a lot like those LED lights you would see in car shops. You kick them on when they're first warming up, you hear that some noise kind of like that. But it was extended and it was pulsating. It was almost like we got outside the house. Pulsating got louder. It was directly above the house. And I'm still screaming, "Mom, please get up. Please get up." Next thing I know, I'm watching my house start shrinking as I'm being taken through the air and into this craft. It seemed metallic, partially cloaked. By the time I started seeing that, I honestly started disassociating. I realized something bad was about to happen and thought that nobody was going to be able to come get me. Then we took off. The interior of the craft was dark, which is not really too surprising considering that these beings, they had sort of wide eyes that any biologist would directly here on Earth would assume that these beings came primarily from sort of nocturnal environment, and they needed those big eyes in order to see. They took my clothes off, put me on this table, secured me down, and I just sat there, unfazed. I figured I had no clue what these things were, what was going on. I just know that something was happening to me. There were examination tools being brought out that started to dig into me, but I was so far checked out mentally that I couldn't feel a thing. Then I hear this woman's voice, likely some kind of telepathic message, but for me it felt like it was coming through a hidden radio somewhere. These beings didn't seem to register it, but I did. It was a woman's voice. Sounded like she was in her 20s, had sort of a soft kind of UK accent, UK mixed with a little bit of Glaswegian. And I remember her words exactly because when I heard it, something about the familiarity behind it felt like I knew who it was. But right in that moment, I knew it was somebody that may try to help me. I remember the words clearly. Said, "If you can hear me, please just hold on. We're coming. Dad, Dakota." And she said it exactly like that. "Dad, Dakota." She blurted something she wasn't supposed to say, tried to correct herself, hoping I didn't register it. Back then, I didn't. But now I know better. Upon hearing this woman's voice, I started to pull out of the disassociation real quick. Started to get a better layout of what was going on behind me. One of the X5s was communicating with something else. It looked like it was through a holographic projection. It was communicating with some kind of matra, like it was reporting on some sort of findings. All I knew back then was that this thing looked mean. Like the things that took me, they were like the mindless idiot minions compared to that thing. During that transmission, the next thing I know, something hit the craft. Then there was 4 people that moved in, and quickly they took out my captors. Next thing I know, there's this woman that approaches me, helps me get off the table, and I recognized her voice right away. I recognized her eyes. She was beautiful. She was a beautiful lady. She helped calm me down. Immediately, I knew I could trust her. Didn't know why, but she tried to do her best to answer as many questions as she could. Once I had a little bit of time to process and come under my own control, a man she worked with brought me over my clothes so I can at least change into something, because I was practically naked by the time they got there. And she escorted me back to their craft, because she said she wanted to take a look and make sure I was okay. I didn't really have any extensive injuries. They were able to examine me pretty quickly. They realized that there was possibly some sort of implant. That was quickly taken care of and attuned especially to this woman and to those she worked with, where we can communicate just fine. What mattered was I was safe. What mattered was she was there. I even got to talk to her at one point, asked her why she was doing these type of stuff. I wanted to get to know her. I wanted to get to know the people that rescued me. Thank them for helping me. This woman, she tells me that she got involved because of her parents. She wanted to help people just like her parents did. She even told me that the reason why she came for me is that we've known each other for a very long time, and that I was just like them at one point. That there were certain people on Earth who were picked in order to come down to Earth and help people. But sometimes those people get targeted by the bad guys. She never directly told me who she was that day, just that she was someone who knew me for a very long time. It's something that Elena Denon theorized when she had me on her channel was that some of my visitors that have been with me for pretty much most of my life may have come through time. And I speculated that this woman may have been my wife. Turns out I was only half correct. My wife is deployed on an envoy. She's currently in a stasis pod. And while technically her other forms come through time, and they have, their interactions on planet have to be minimal, because it might create some sort of paradox that might cause some damage. The woman who helped save me was my daughter, my oldest, all grown up. She wanted to tell me right then and there she is emotional as hell. She's not too different from her old man, but there were certain protocols that she had to follow. But knowing how she is, she would eventually find a way to bend the rules. Just a little. Scary how much a statement like that validates what I suspected. Instead of returning me home where I was originally taken from, I asked if they would drop me off at my grandparents'. I recall being able to see it nearby from where we were. I didn't feel safe going back. I didn't know if those things were going to be waiting for me. No matter how much my daughter and her crew tried to reassure me. Perhaps my daughter had a bit of an idea. She knew that I would have to be mind fogged before I was sent back. But if I was sent back someplace I didn't remember leaving, she knew that a part of me would always keep searching no matter how much I tried to deny it. That little piece of me that wanted to remember them would be fed. That little bit of curiosity would be fed just enough for me to keep going. And she knew it. She knew that I would keep looking, and she wanted me to remember. So that's how I ended up lying through the wall of my grandparents' house and into the bed that I had there at the time. The same room I had back then was the same room that my daughter would make another appearance. Instead, appearing as a 6-year-old girl who would appear in order to try to prevent me from taking my own life. This entire ordeal I nicknamed Olivia Paradox. For some reason, that name just always stuck out. She was showing up so much over the years that it felt wrong, just kept calling her the little girl, the little girl. I even asked her if she liked that name, and she said she did. From the point I was 12 onwards, she would appear as a little girl. She would look like she was about 6 years old, but to those she spoke to, her behavior was close to that of a 3-year-old. Mind you, her father is a 6'7" giant, and her mother, as I recall, was barely tall herself. And she got her daddy's height. I didn't think to connect the two incidents between my abduction and this matter of divine intervention that prevented me from taking my own life. The only thread that was similar that I knew to look at was the fact that I ended up in the same room both times. My grandfather, when he passed away from cancer, he also died in that room. There was a brief period where, yeah, it was my room, but after I moved out of my grandparents and back in with my mom, they just kind of used it as a storage room. When my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer, that was his own little sanctuary away from kids, the dogs, when he was having his bad days. That was the same room he died in. So, by default, one can assume that there might have been some sort of portal in that room, perhaps in the closet where I tried to hurt myself. One thing that surprised both me and Olivia was that during my grandfather's final moments, he saw her, something we both didn't expect, which at the time led me to believe that perhaps it's only blood relatives of Olivia who are in their final moments of life that are able to see her. Again, I was working off of some sort of weird time travel theory in order to try to explain it, because it was clear that she was my daughter, and any time I tried to deny it, that voice would always come back saying, "How dare you deny her?" There was a lot of work that was being done behind the scenes that I couldn't pick up on, either because I wasn't in the right mindset or whatever the case may be, to where she had to do what she did in order to help me. She was allowed to do it because my soul group, if you will, knew that that was going to be the quickest way to get me to wake up, to realize a child was in danger. To realize that it was my own child would amplify that even more. Over the years, Olivia made several appearances. Either when my mindset was just low, she would come in, pop around, just say, "Hey, we're still here." And she would still look like a little kid, not an adult. Perhaps there was some sort of training she was going through at the time, because one of the people that spotted her pointed out that my daughter would act like she was seeing someone else that they couldn't see. Like, say our sight is like a camera and there was someone just off frame that she was looking at that was guiding her. The incident with my grandfather, I would find out years later, was likely because my grandfather was my father from back in Talihara. I found this out after it was that sector was all clear. Their home, the Thula star system, or Sirius B, was given the all clear, and everybody who had ties there was able to go visit their family. And my in-laws wanted to see me. It was a beautiful reunion. I got to try replicator food, and surprisingly delicious. We all got to talk, and it was just this atmosphere of unity. There was going up there, I didn't feel. I felt genuinely nervous. I felt like, a guy meeting a girl's parents for the very first time. It was that level of nervousness. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just wanting to make sure everything went right. All three of our kids were there, and my mother-in-law, she goes to ask me a question, and I know that she's asking me as Dakota, because a lot of people think I'm joking when I say this, but the main thing that helps me differentiate between when I'm acting as a Larian or when I'm acting as Dakota is whether or not I still have my hair. My mother-in-law, she asked me, it's like, so Dakota, how's your father doing? I had to stop and think because I was thinking she was asking about this body's biological father, who I haven't seen since I was 15, and who currently sits behind bars with no chance of parole until I turned 40. I don't even know if I would recognize him if he were to walk in the room, so to speak. She saw the look of confusion on my face as I was thinking this, and she's like, "Well, didn't?" And I kind of glanced over at my wife, and she actually just has this look on her face, like she's want to say, "No, he doesn't know. He doesn't know." She realized I caught her, and she takes a deep breath, and she just reassures me through a telepathic message, basically just saying, "You won't." She's you weren't supposed to know yet, but your father from Talihara was with you on Earth, on Terra, is what I believe she actually said. By this time, I obviously trusted this woman. She gave me no indication that she had any malintention. She was just there because we were there simply because she was my wife. She was someone I trusted. And we even flew missions together during my time as a Larian while we were with the Federation. And that's probably where I'm going to end up being back with once this body dies. We've had a long history. So I trusted her. So naturally, when she goes to say this, I was like, oh, wait, who is it? And she kind of takes another deep sigh and she's like, just think, you already figured out that people who go on envoys are still similar. They're on the bodies they take on, who they are as people are still very similar to who they are upstairs. Just think back to that day you had to leave when your father said goodbye. Who does that remind you of? I started to play it back in my head. She even put her fingers up against my temple, which was kind of her way of bridging the gap between us, setting up a mental link between us through physical touch. It was also her way of keeping me calm as these ordeals happened. It's something that she actually would teach our daughter to do when she would take on her missions, which is why when she came to save me that day in my closet when I was 12, my daughter came to save me when I was 12. She did brush up against my temple before giving me a kiss on the cheek, and that was what cut off the connection. Her mother was the one who taught her. And as I was playing through this, I was playing through my last moments on Talihara with my family before I got captured. Then I started to realize my father was with me here on Earth as my grandfather, as my mom's father. When it comes to envoys, the bloodlines of the mother's side had to be altered. I don't know much about my grandfather's side of the family. Not a lot of us do, because it wasn't until he was diagnosed with cancer and they were trying to go through background to find out what caused it that he learned he was actually adopted. And from what he knew, he did have a lot of relatives that went insane, went behind bars. For what reason? I don't know. I still don't know to this day. Maybe that's going to be an upcoming project. But nevertheless, I started to compare the two. Again, like I said, people who take on envoys, they usually, if they don't go insane from trying to understand everything, their personalities and even some of their physical appearances will be very similar. That's when I realized my grandfather was my father. He got himself involved in a different Starseed program than I did in order to try to help me as much as he could to make up for the fact that he had to abandon me, which ended up being very interesting because something I was always told, my grandfather, he had a major temper, but he always had issues with blood pressure. Doctors were always trying to harass him to get his blood pressure down, get his blood pressure down. But the only thing that really helped him was that he became a grandpa. His firstborn grandson was born, me. Seems like a sweet story, but now I've come to realize apparently it has a lot more significance. And would also explain why my grandfather, when he would try to communicate with us after he passed away, the first thing he would talk about was that he was excited his hair came back. Being that was the case, apparently I wasn't too far off. My grandfather could see her because that was his granddaughter in multiple lifetimes, as a matter of fact. Last time I saw them together, my grandfather and my daughter Olivia, I was actually on a riverboat in France. It was there's a cruise that takes you up past the Eiffel Tower so you can watch the light show up close. It started to rain a little bit, so I had the top deck to myself until I felt someone tap on my shoulder. At first, I thought someone was trying to get a picture, and I was standing in the way, and they were trying to ask me, which side. So I looked over myself and said, "Oh, sorry." Then I realized it was my grandfather with a head full of hair and my daughter. They were just standing there, clear as day. Man, I honestly broke down. There was a lot going on in that time of my life. I was just looking for my next adventure, trying to clear my head a bit. And what they told me was that they weren't going to be visiting as much. They were still going to check in, but they didn't feel that they needed me, or I didn't need them around as much. I was growing as a person. My grandfather's last words to me that day were, "I'm proud of you." My daughter stuck around a little bit, and I started questioning her. It's like, if you're going, can you just maybe tell me something about your mom? Last words she said to me were, "Don't worry, Daddy. Mommy's coming soon. Just keep fighting. Mommy will need you to help her. Just keep fighting." It's scary how much that particular phrase came to fruition. In December of 2019, I decided to conduct a series of experiments that would test the limits of my seemingly boundless connections through time and space. I would dub it the Hunt for Infinite Earths. Why did I choose this name? I was inspired to go into these experiments after I learned of a number of authors who have had incidents where it seemed their characters, completely fictional, somehow managed to come to life and enter our world. Now, this is something that I related to quite quickly. One of my earliest book series, The Ones Who Walk All Worlds, that was my attempt to jot down various visions I was receiving at a young age. From like ages 9 on until about age 16, 15, 16, somewhere around there. I don't know why I was receiving these messages. It's probably because my head was already being fired up. My head was already firing off because of things going on at the time that I've shared. But I needed some sort of outlet for these things. But this was still early on in my development, where I still had a lot of doubts about its legitimacy. So I created a science fiction novel series based around the visions and my understanding of all this at the time. With the hunt for infinite Earths, the idea was to utilize methods of spiritual communication, which in theory were the result of various dimensions and densities, potentially even realities, all operating within a singular shared space. That all the three-dimensional worlds are somehow resonating throughout a four-dimensional space and echoing into the other worlds that are parallel. This was the idea. How to test it? Essentially, it was how do I put this? A coordinated channeling effort. Now, I know there's probably going to be some of you saying, oh, Dakota, you shouldn't channel. It's dangerous. You don't know what's going to come through. Yeah, I know. I was willing to take that risk, though. I wanted to see how far I could push these things, and it was best that I be brought to the subject instead of anyone else, because if something went wrong, it falls back directly on me, and I minimalize outside casualties. But nevertheless, I had to somehow coordinate it. How was I going to target these other realities? Who was I going to target? What would be the criteria I would need? One idea that was proposed through someone just making a smart-ass remark after watching episodes of Supernatural where they're traveling the multiverse is that maybe I would need to target people who have been to this world. And something about that can bring that individual back here instead of a parallel one, if that makes any sense. This was when I started throwing a bit caution and sanity out of the window, trying to understand everything that was going on. Throughout my research, 3 targets came to mind specifically. One of which is the reason why I stuck with the hunt for infinite Earths. You'll see why it's a reference to something here very soon. My first target that I picked was the being known as Verlon from the 1977 South British television hijacking. Clearly, it was a being that had some sort of knowledge about what was going on here on Earth. And if I was able to catch a one-on-one with the guy, there'd be a lot of questions that we could ask. Be an interesting conversation, wouldn't you agree? The second figure was another ET in the traditional sense that physically visited this world. The second target was Valthor, a Venusian who arrived on Earth and spoke with several major political figures, including Dwight Eisenhower. By all accounts, he was still alive and well and somewhere out there, so let's see what happens if I go knocking on his door. The third, and probably the most confusing of the 3, fans of DC Comics might like this. My third target was none other than John Constantine, and I'll explain why here in a sec. The first 2 targets, simple enough. They are genuine ETs that had some sort of interaction with this world. So chances are they would recognize where the signal I was utilizing came from, and they would be able to follow it and maybe respond somehow. Exactly how? I don't know. Maybe they can make ships pop up in the sky. Maybe their voices could come through. Maybe like some of the other recordings I've put together for this broadcast, you may hear some other voices besides my own as I'm talking about it. John Constantine was a rather interesting case. And you can even look this up. Several of the early writers involved with John Constantine swear to this day that they've seen him, a comic book character, in our world. And not just some look-alike. They swear up and down that it was him. And Constantine is known for multiversal travel. So it's perhaps one of the more interesting cases. I purposely contacted one of the writers. His name was Jamie Delano. He was shocked that I wrote to him in regards to this case because I had reason to suspect that the experiments worked. He was older, but had access to better audio equipment than I did. Couldn't exactly make out some of the recordings I did. I was able to, but something that he tossed off, probably just being polite to old age. But one thing he warned me about was that when it came to John Constantine, he was not someone you wanted to be your friend. He was a professional con man with expertise in occult practices. You go into the background of how John Constantine came together. Alan Moore was a practicing occultist and based very real occult concepts, used very real occult concepts, rather, to create John. With the Verlon broadcast, it did seem like something was trying to come through, but I wasn't getting a lot of luck. With Val Thor, interestingly enough, a craft showed up when focusing on him. It was a small metallic sphere from as far as I could tell. I tried recording it on camera, but I'm willing to chalk it up to the distance away that it was flying, how far it was away from me, because I was just had my cell phone on me trying to record it. It didn't really detect it unless I went through and added an edge detection filter to the video. Then it spotted where the craft was flying. As for whether or not it was the Valthor, chances are unlikely. I will say that. As far as with John, though, that's where it gets interesting. There's a point in these broadcasts where I would call out to John, try to get his attention, try to get him to talk back to me. It seemed like I was getting a response, but he was mostly confused, trying to figure out how the fuck I was calling him. Then one night, this is where John Constantine is actually where the practice I use of running a sleep talking app while you're in bed got started. All of a sudden, one of the recordings the app picked up on. Basically, how it worked is that you had it set to a certain level. If it picked up any noises that were louder than that level, it would record like a little 10-second snippets, or however long the sound was going for. For some reason, a source of static came out of nowhere. I wasn't playing any white noise. There wasn't any TVs on to an old channel. Nothing like that. White noise came out of nowhere. Then all of a sudden, there was a woman's voice that followed that said, "If you can hear me, Constantine wants you." Whether or not it was the John Constantine, the skeptical part of my brain wants to say, of fucking course not. He's just a character. But you had the phenomenon of tulpas, you have, thought forms, poltergeist activity, where psychic ability seems to be able to cause manifestations like this. Or maybe there was, in fact, a world out there where John Constantine exists. And if I was able to make contact with this world, and he's out there, does that mean other characters, other fictional characters could be out there? How did I get to knocking on that door? The channeling session was a bit more coordinated than just asking in darkness. I had to tune myself to the Archangel Metatron, who a lot of people say is essentially the main librarian for the Akashic Records, which are supposed to be essentially the Akashic Records was supposed to be essentially a record of everything that has happened, is happening, or will happen. And Metatron was supposed to be the main gatekeeper. Now, if this was a physical place and not just some psychic manifestation that certain sensitives reported seeing, because seeing it as like a library or a hall of records was easier for them to understand. So essentially that part of reality projected that image so that the person who was observing knew what the basic purpose was. Hard to say. If Metatron was a physical being, or if he was just a high ranking, a high part of frequency, part of source. The lore behind Metatron is that he was also once human, that he was supposed to be Noah's grandfather, Enoch. Yeah, I did my research. I know my shit. Y'all thinking just because I'm a young whippersnapper, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I still feel like it, but nevertheless, I try to do my research because some of the things that happened in regards to this, I still am shocked. Focusing on Metatron, essentially, It was to use him to dial into other realities. Metatron's true form, not the humanoid persona that a lot of us think of when we think of the angels, but his true form is supposed to be essentially a planet the size of the Earth covered in eyes. It was one of those situations where if we asked nicely enough, maybe Metatron was willing to help. Or maybe it was a situation where I was utilizing these visual images to help tune myself. In theory, anybody should be able to do this without any outside help. Any special technology, any meditative practices, any magical practices, any rituals, all these, in my experience at least, are just like visual aids. But I have no doubt something made contact, because John, even with all the warnings that I've had about him, ended up becoming a valuable ally. The events leading up to the 2020s started to amplify things for me on multiple levels. I had gotten involved in paranormal investigation at the age of 14, utilizing my height and the fact that a lot of people assumed I was much older than I actually was to get my start, and I quickly gained a lot of attention. Unfortunately, there were several instances where I took on rather nasty cases, some of which led to potential exorcisms. During these incidents, people would swear that there was some sort of radiance about me when I was in that drive, in that moment, to where they thought that I was taken over by something much more powerful. They didn't feel it was evil or anything. It was just pure power. They would say things like they swore they would see my eyes roll to the back of my head, that my voice would deepen. A couple instances, they thought they saw something with wings hanging around me. There would even be a couple instances where they thought they saw a little girl. Any claims of demonic, I would only have one potentially genuine case a year. Most of them minor, relatively easy to clear out once I identified what the problem was, what lured those beings there in the first place. Come the 2020s, was going to be almost 5-10 a year. Right as word of the pandemic started busting out in China, ironically. It was during these times I started to research an entity a little bit deeper that I've had experiences before. I thought my first encounter with him was shortly after my father went to prison, and he tried to offer me a deal to take out my father, to which I said no, started screaming at him. I started to research this being because more and more sightings were occurring. Unfortunately, some idiots out there were purposely overdosing themselves on Benadryl in order to encounter this thing. Genuine idiots. You fuck around with drugs like that, I'm sorry, you're an idiot. Purposely overdosing? I never understood the logic behind it. I know there's genetic factors and it's a condition and people need help. I fully believe that. But to willingly engage yourself, no matter what circumstances may be, whether you're pressured into it, maybe you did it because if you thought you chickened out, you would be put in danger. Dumb choices were made to put these people in that spot. But another thing that stuck out to me with this particular being was that it seemed to focus heavy on individuals with strong psychic dispositions and had a history of violence. Whether they were involved in a serious domestic violence situation, they had to defend themselves. I wanted to know why. And as part of a pastime for the 2020s, when pandemic started, I thought, you know what? I think I will make movies. I was going to make a documentary on this thing. And so I started my research. Scarily enough, I put that word into the universe, and the universe obliged, helping me track down genuine cases. One such case that came forward that stuck out above the rest was a father who was apparently trying to call as many different groups as he possibly could in order to get his family help because some dark force seemed to be harassing him. It had an attachment to him for quite some time, and he just dealt with it, but he started to realize the level of danger he put himself and his family in after it started to approach his 3-year-old son. The call came in on a hotline I had set up at the time within minutes of me getting home. Unfortunately, it was through Google Voice, so I wasn't able to answer in time, but the gentleman left a voicemail. I listened to it, and something told me that I needed to take this call. It was important I take this call. It was a 3-hour conversation with this gentleman. He was telling me everything. It had all the classic signs. Then he started to go into this entity's description that sometimes it would look like a dude wearing a long trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Same thing, very similar being that I saw at the age of 14 and at the age of 3. Some tall dude wearing a long trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Being that the father that was disclosing this information clearly had some sort of connection with this thing, so it was trying to gain his trust. I asked him if he ever got a name, and he wasn't exactly sure of it, but the name stuck out with a theory I was working on for the documentary. Also, during this phone call, what validated that this was in fact a genuine case was that in the background there was what sounded like a 6-7-year-old boy who very angrily said, "Put down that fucking phone or I'm going to kill you, bitch." I heard it clear as day. The father didn't. I physically had to stop him and ask him what the hell was going on. As this conversation started, he immediately sent me a text message, photos of plane tickets for his wife and son, who had already left the house, flown across country to try to get away from this stuff. He did this to validate that he was alone in that house. So unless his dog somehow managed to speak complete sentences like that, and I didn't hear any, smacks of those little plastic buttons people can get for their pets, something was in that house. I go to tell him what it sounded like, and he freezes because apparently his wife had a miscarriage. They knew it was a boy about 6-7 years prior. A lot of people would assume that this was some sort of demonic entity simply mimicking the child in order to affect the family, which could very well be the case. However, the multiple reports that I came across indicated something far more sinister. The father even validated it. My theory was that this being did not act alone. The theory sprang from Breton mythology, that some of the earliest versions of this being were known as the Anku, servants of death, and that the first one, or either the main one, obviously with myths and legends, there's going to be different versions, either the very first or the main one that was in charge was none other than the firstborn son of Adam and Eve. The name that the father gave me of this being that was talking to him, that was targeting his son, he said his name was Cain. He would try to specify it was like sugar cane because he didn't know the significance of it. He knew basic biblical concepts, God, devil, heaven, hell. That's it. Adam, Eve. That's it. That's literally all he knew. When he told me this name, I honestly had to freeze. He heard the pause, and he goes to ask me, "Well, what's the significance of this? What's going on? What are you thinking?" And it scared the shit out of him when I told him the theory. Theory was that this being was none other than the first murderer, and that he was being targeted. He thought that he had done something in life to attract this thing's attention, to which I reassured him that was not the case. He physically thought that I was going to say something along the lines of he was potentially even being abusive towards his son, and that's why his son was being targeted. And I assured him to the best of my ability is that chances are his son may have some sort of disposition to this type of stuff, but there's a pretty good chance that he may grow out of it, for a lack of a better word, just because of how the human brain works. Now, that didn't say that something wouldn't happen to the child. Hopefully something relatively innocent, like he gets older, plays football, gets a blow to the head, that the stuff may come back. And if I told him if it does, please feel free to contact me because I know I'll be able to walk you through it. I dealt with it myself. I even told him the story about my daughter to try to reassure him that I understood how crazy this makes you feel. The father was reassured. Then I gave him some instructions on how to essentially ward himself, utilizing a sigil of my own design. In some of my research, I got into researching magic of pretty much every variation I can get my hands on. And unfortunately, there was incidents where I had to read up on satanic magic as well in order to truly understand what was going on for a case. Rumors of occults, kidnapping pets, and slaughtering them. Rumors were never founded by police, but where I live, it's not exactly hard to get rid of a dead animal. The sigil ended up being something of value later on. And Kane, as he would come to identify himself, showed physical. It was almost like something about this thing gave him PTSD. So it was a chance to fight. Giving the father the sigil, telling him that he can either print it out, draw it, visualize it, it'll keep this thing at bay. It stopped. This eventually, the being just stopped trying to fuck with the family. And last I checked, they're doing much better now. But the following day, something emerged that only deepened the mystery that much more. Something I wouldn't believe had I not seen it for myself.